and welcome to Talking Migration. I'm Clara Sanderlind and Talking Migration is supported by the University of Manchester. Earlier this year, the Danish Parliament voted in favour of a policy of so-called externalisation of asylum. According to this new law, Denmark should seek to enter bilateral agreements with third countries, who will then process and protect asylum seekers there instead of in Denmark. Other countries have sought similar solutions, but few, with some notable exceptions, have implemented them. The practical as well as legal obstacles to moving asylum outside of a country's territory are high, and there are worries about how the rights of refugees and asylum seekers would be protected. To discuss this new policy, I'm joined by Nicholas Tan, senior researcher at the Danish Institute for Human Rights. Nicholas Tan has written several articles on asylum policy, externalisation, and Danish asylum policy. I started by asking him to briefly describe the new Danish policy.
So the Danish proposal entails the policy of when asylum seekers arrive in Denmark, they should be transferred to a third country outside the EU, where they will receive their asylum procedure. It's not clear if that procedure should be done by Danish authorities or the third country's authorities. That's really sort of up for discussion. And what gets missed in this debate is once the asylum procedure is done, the policy approach says that all refugees should actually remain in that third country and be integrated there. So it's not the externalisation of just the asylum procedure for a temporary amount of time, which one could maybe understand in some situations. It's the idea of, in fact, delegating responsibility for both the asylum procedure and the rest of refugees' lives to this third country.
Is there any discussion that something like the UNHCR or a third party would do the asylum procedure?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, the asylum procedure question is really up for debate. The Danish government in January of 2021 put out a sort of concept note around the proposal, and that concept note put forward two models. Model one was essentially a Danish-run asylum centre in the third country with Danish lawyers, Danish officers, Danish administrative decision makers. And model two was the third country doing the asylum procedure, presumably with some Danish support. Now, of course, we know that UNHCR in some countries does carry out RSD, refugee status determination procedures, but as far as I can tell in the Danish approach, the idea is either Denmark would do it or the third country's authorities would do the asylum procedures.
Okay. So if it was the case that it was Denmark who did it, presumably that would be with Danish asylum laws, which may differ from the country where they're in. And if it's also the case that they're meant to be, if it's a positive application, they're meant to be staying in that country, then how would that work in terms of the jurisdiction of it? That basically the third country would have to then accept Denmark's asylum laws.
I think you raise a really, really, really good question that hasn't been adequately answered by the Danish government at this point. I think what the Danish proposal envisages is a bilateral treaty between the two countries. So presumably, if it was Danish authorities doing the asylum procedure, then part of the treaty would be a clause stating that the third country would accept the decisions of the Danish authorities on the third country's territory. So I agree, highly unusual, but legally possible. And then you also raise a good question about this potential lack of symmetry in terms of legal standards. So one could easily imagine a situation, for example, where Danish law recognises LGBT asylum seekers as potential refugees. A third country may not do so, and then there would need to be some sort of legal harmonisation around that conflict. What I would imagine, or what the Danish government has said, in fact, is that before transfer to the third country, there will be initial screening in Denmark, not an asylum procedure, but a screening to assess whether it's safe to send this person to the third country. So already the Danish government has said, if the person comes from the third country itself, then they won't be transferred there, which makes sense as a matter of non-conformal. But again, if we have a country that is particularly inhospitable to LGBT asylum claims, for example, it may be that all LGBT asylum claimants would end up remaining in Denmark and going through national procedures here.
I see. And how does this proposal compare to other countries? So, for example, the UK has recently proposed something similar, I think, and then you have existing arrangements in Australia that maybe they're a bit similar.
Yeah, so on the UK proposal, I'm aware that it's in the Nationality and Borders Bill, but I haven't seen any detail around it, so it's difficult to compare in the abstract. On the Australian side, depending on the model Denmark takes forward, it could look quite a lot like the Australian approach. Australia has also attempted to both transfer asylum seekers to Papua New Guinea and Nauru, have their asylum processes there, and try to provide protection there. That's clearly failed. Neither of those states have been able to provide lawful asylum procedures or, in fact, to integrate refugees successfully. But the Danish proposal would be unique if, in fact, we end up with a situation of Danish officials doing asylum procedures in a third country. That would be, I think, fairly novel. And of course, it's quite different to the first iteration of the Australian Pacific solution, which only involved the procedure side. It was only focused on getting through an asylum process in a third country. So what's really important to note, and often sometimes lost in the detail here, is the idea of Denmark's approach is not only procedures extraterritorially, but also protection in a third country.
So, but in the Australian case, I thought it was also protection.
Correct. In a second iteration of the
right
solution, yeah, which is run from 2013 to today, that's correct. It's this attempt to try and both provide processing and protection in a third state. But the first iteration between 2001 2007 was just the asylum procedure. And
would you say, in terms of the Australian model, that the first iteration, was that any more feasible or successful than the second? Like, would it be possible to say that you could actually have procedure but not protection?
I think from an international legal perspective, it is easier to provide a fair and efficient asylum procedure in a third country than third country protection, because an asylum procedure is a fairly concrete, temporary activity, that can be achieved in a matter of months, and then people can move on to either refugee protection or return. Whereas the idea of providing third country protection in a country like Nauru or Papua New Guinea has been wildly unsuccessful. And that, in a way, that's been one of the major flaws of the Australian model, that Australia was simply unable to find solutions for refugees transferred to those two very poor and undeveloped states.
Right, interesting. So I've jumped ahead a little bit, but I was going to ask you what the legal framework is for this kind of externalization. You've already touched upon it a bit, but would you like to add anything or expand on it?
Of course. So another sort of novel part of the Danish approach is, I think it's for the first time we've seen a European country legislate for this form of externalization. And of course, in Europe, we have an extra layer of human rights law and refugee law, indeed, from the European Convention on Human Rights and the EU Charter. So, but from an international perspective, the legal framework here starts, of course, with the 1951 Refugee Convention. The 1951 Refugee Convention does not include an explicit right to asylum, but does include, of course, a prohibition on sending a person to either to their own country or to any other country where they'd be in danger. And that gap is where the Danish government is trying to operate here, saying that we will not provide territorial asylum to all asylum seekers, but we will also not, will remain in compliance with the non-refoulement principle by transferring them to a third country that respects their rights. So that's the sort of legal territory in which we're operating. What I think is also important here is that the Danish policy started out as a European vision, a vision not just for the reform of Denmark's asylum policy, but for Europe's more broadly. And what we've seen over the past couple of years is Danish politicians essentially try to pitch their model to other European leaders, and so far without success. So we've seen the EU really turn their back on the Danish proposal so far. There's certainly been interest from the UK and some interest from Austria as well. But the key difference here, and this is becoming a little legally technical, the key difference is that Denmark has an opt-out of the EU asylum system for the most part. And the EU asylum system states quite clearly that if an asylum seeker arrives on European territory, claims asylum, then that person has the right to remain on European soil while the asylum procedure is in place. So that means, in effect, that what Denmark can do, other European states cannot do because of their involvement in the European asylum system.
Because Denmark has opted out.
Because Denmark has this opt-out, exactly.
Right. And so you're saying there that not that many countries have followed so far, but do you think they've not followed then because they know that they have this restriction based on their cooperation with the European asylum system?
I mean, it's a highly politicised question, obviously, so it's difficult to know where the law starts and the politics ends. But I think it's clear that because Denmark can do this lawfully, there's nothing that stands in the way of Denmark legislating for these transfers, at least in the abstract. As far as, in my legal view, all other EU states who are part of the EU asylum system cannot do this, lawfully speaking, as the law currently stands. So that has been a pretty clear roadblock for the spread of the Danish approach into many other EU countries.
I suppose that's why it's the UK who's proposed it then, because they don't have those constraints. Right, interesting. So one of the main questions I've heard, not just against the Danish proposal, but in general, when different parties suggest something like this, is who's actually going to do this? Like, who are the third countries who are actually going to be willing to agree on these to do this job? And does Denmark have any ideas or any countries that would be interested?
So Denmark has a task force working on this question currently through diplomatic channels. And initially the government was fairly open in nominating countries like Morocco and Tunisia to do this sort of work as potential partners. The problem with that approach, of course, is that as soon as that was made public, the governments and diplomatic corps of these countries almost immediately rejected the approach and expressed a lack of interest in cooperation. So currently, the government is pursuing this as a diplomatic matter in confidential talks. There's been a lot of discussion about Rwanda as a potential partner country. So in the same week that the legislation passed enabling transfers from Denmark, the Danish Immigration and Development Minister travelled to Kigali and signed an MOU with the Rwandan government. That MOU, the Memorandum of Understanding, did not provide for the transfer of asylum seekers from Denmark to Rwanda. In fact, what it entailed was Danish assistance to Rwanda's asylum system and indeed Danish resettlement from Rwanda to Denmark. But nonetheless, of course, the sort of politics of the passage of a bill and the signing of an MOU with Rwanda seemed to suggest that Rwanda was a potential partner. That MOU might be seen as a step along the way towards bilateral cooperation, but we simply don't know yet. Media reported here last week that the Danish government was also in talks with Ukraine as a potential partner country. Of course, I don't know which or if any states will come on board with the Danish proposal, but I am a little bit sceptical or wary of those who completely discount the possibility. I think we've seen before in both the Australia and US examples that such externalisation policies have been realised, and it only takes one government to agree to cooperate with Denmark, or even to enter into a sort of pilot program for this policy to be enacted in practice.
One thing that I was wondering with these countries that you've mentioned, like I know, it might not be any of those countries in the end, but as you said at the start as well, it might actually be that these countries are not necessarily safe for everyone, or that people in fact are fleeing from those countries, so then they wouldn't be sent back there. But what would be sort of the legal context or requirement for these countries being deemed then safe third countries? Like, would it be, I think you were suggesting that perhaps it would be determined on a case-by-case basis whether the country is safe for the individual asylum seeker, or would it be, I'm assuming there must be some assessment of whether the country is safe at all for anyone.
Yeah, so I think the Danish government has certainly guaranteed to provide an individual assessment of asylum seekers arriving to Denmark, a sort of a pre-transfer screening, as it were. And that, of course, is to comply with Denmark's obligations, both with respect to non-refoulement, but also with respect to the prohibition of collective expulsion. The government has not been so forthcoming about what entails a safe third country. I think they've made references to a defensible asylum system, for example, to potentially being part of the Refugee Convention. But that's pretty unclear at this stage what sort of state we're talking about. Earlier, the government guaranteed that it would be a democratic state. They've since walked that back, potentially, for example, with Rwanda in mind. So there's a lot of really serious or really important both sort of legal, practical and operational details to be spelled out and explained before this ever happens, if and when it happens.
And what would you say are the risks to asylum seekers' rights with this kind of system?
So I think we've seen from the Australian example that there are many, many grave risks to asylum seekers. Of course, some of them extend to questions of status. In Nauru and Papua New Guinea, for example, we saw that those governments simply didn't have operating asylum systems when people were being transferred. And so people ended up in sort of legal limbo, in indefinite detention for up to a couple of years to wait for an asylum decision. So the sort of legal questions are really important on the one hand. On the other hand, of course, there are more reception questions around what sort of centre will they be hosted in. The Danish government doesn't refer to any detention in these arrangements, which is a positive thing. But nonetheless, I mean, I'd be really interested to know what material conditions were, both in the third country in general, of course, but also in the specific reception arrangements for asylum seekers. And then there are all sorts of other, maybe more medium and long-term questions about, well, what happens after the asylum procedure to these people? What sort of integration programs exist? What about particularly vulnerable asylum seekers who may have pregnancies or health conditions that need to be addressed? At what point does Denmark's responsibility end and the third country's responsibility kick in? So many, many questions remain unanswered.
And one thing I was wondering as well is, what about deportations or removals of those who have their application rejected?
Yeah, this is a good point. So presumably that of a group of asylum seekers transferred to a third country, there will be a certain proportion who do not have a protection need. Again, the Danish government has been pretty quiet on this discrete question. But presumably there'll need to be some responsibility sharing or allocation of responsibility for those who are in fact not in need of international protection. So this could be a solution via, another pathway in the third state, or indeed voluntary or forced repatriations.
And are there any benefits that you could see with this kind of system?
So the Danish government has labelled this system as ultimately humanitarian in the sense that it prevents people smuggling and risky journeys. I don't tend to agree with that characterisation, and that's because, as I mentioned earlier, it's no longer a sort of European vision. It's just a Danish vision. So I don't see how this particular approach would prevent people crossing the Mediterranean, for example, given other EU countries are available for territorial asylum. It's just that Denmark may not be. I'm more broadly maybe, in fact, interested in third country asylum processing arrangements if they can, in fact, prevent deaths at sea, for example. But I think this idea of completely delegating responsibility both for the asylum process and for long-term protection of refugees doesn't have a lot of protective potential to it.
Is there anything you'd like to add there we haven't discussed?
Maybe just one final point. We've discussed, Clara, the sort of legal reality that most European countries who are part of the EU asylum rules can't carry out this policy. But that hasn't stopped some other countries who are not bound by these rules expressing interest. So we talked about the UK for a little bit, but also Norway and Switzerland are other potential possibilities. And that's also something the Danish government has pursued to some extent, this idea of a sort of coalition of the willing approach, not to get the whole EU on board, but a certain selection of countries who have the legal and the political possibility to pursue this approach. And that may be a way forward. We'll just have to wait and see.
To find out more about Nicholas Tan's work, see the show notes or links on Twitter @TalkingMig. You may be particularly interested in a blog post that he recently wrote about this new Danish policy. You'll find the links to that either in the show notes or on Twitter. That was all for this time. Thank you so much for listening.